Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. It was a crisp autumn morning when Sarah first mentioned the house-flipping idea. We were sitting in the breakfast nook of our suburban home, sunlight streaming through the window onto her freshly brewed coffee and the stacks of glossy real estate magazines she had accumulated over the past week. She spoke with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. Not since we first moved into this house, full of dreams of a perfect life. "I've been researching," she said, her eyes lighting up as she flipped through a magazine, stopping at a picture of a sprawling Victorian fixer-upper. "We could start small. I handle the design and renovation, and we hire a real estate agent to help us sell. It could be a great investment." I'd heard Sarah's bursts of excitement before, whether it was starting a fitness routine, taking a photography class, or learning to bake artisan bread. Most of these projects faded quickly, but this time there was something different in her voice, a determination that made me pause before giving my usual polite smile and vague approval. Instead, I said, "If this is something you really want to do, let's make it happen." She beamed at me, and for a fleeting moment, I felt like the husband I used to be, supportive, attentive, present. But then the moment passed, and I buried myself in emails on my phone, already mentally preparing for the long workday ahead. A week later, Sarah announced she had found the perfect real estate agent, Ryan Decker. She described him as successful and well-connected, with a reputation for selling houses quickly and for more than asking price. I didn't give it much thought. Why would I? He was just another professional in the long list of contractors and agents Sarah would work with for this new project. I finally met Ryan when he came to our house for an initial consultation. He arrived 10 minutes early, pulling up in a sleek black Audi that looked brand new. I watched from the window as he stepped out, adjusting his tie and running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. He exuded confidence, the kind that comes with being attractive and knowing it. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried a polished charm that instantly put people at ease. "You must be David," he said, flashing a smile that could sell ice to an Eskimo. His handshake was firm, his grip lingering just long enough to make an impression without overdoing it. "It's great to meet you. Sarah's been telling me about your plans, and I think we're going to make a great team." I nodded, offering a neutral smile. "Good to meet you too. Sarah's really excited about this project." "And she has every reason to be," Ryan replied, his tone warm and enthusiastic. "This market is perfect for flipping, and with her eye for design, I'm confident we'll see some incredible results." He turned his attention to Sarah, who was practically glowing under his praise. She led him into the living room, where she had laid out floor plans and photos of properties she was considering. As they talked, I lingered in the background, pretending to check my phone but really observing. Ryan had an ease about him, a way of making everything sound effortless. I could see why Sarah had been so taken with him. Over the next few weeks, Ryan became a fixture in our lives. Sarah and he would spend hours on the phone or in meetings, discussing potential properties and renovation ideas. I'd come home from work to find them poring over blueprints at the dining table, their heads close together, their laughter filling the room. At first, I chalked it up to the nature of the project. After all, flipping a house was no small task. But there was something about their dynamic that unsettled me. It wasn't anything overt. Ryan was always polite, always professional. Yet, there was an undercurrent to his interactions with Sarah, a subtle chemistry that seemed to crackle in the air when they were together. She laughed more around him, her gestures more animated, her eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in years. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just projecting my own insecurities. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. One evening, I decided to bring it up. Sarah and I were sitting in the living room, the TV playing some crime drama in the background. I turned to her and said, "You and Ryan seem to get along really well." She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Of course we do. We're working together." "Yeah, I know," I said, hesitating. "It's just, you've been spending a lot of time with him lately." "I'm not complaining. I just noticed." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, the warmth in her expression cooled. "David, he's my real estate agent. That's it." If you have a problem with me working with him, just say so. I don't have a problem, I said quickly, raising my hands in surrender. I'm just making an observation. She sighed and leaned back against the couch. This is important to me, David. For once, I'm doing something that's mine. Can't you just trust me? Her words hit me harder than I expected. Of course I trust you, I said, though the doubt creeping into my mind made the words feel hollow. The following weekend, Sarah and Ryan went to an open house together. I'd been invited but used work as an excuse to stay behind. I spent most of the day distracted, checking the clock and wondering when she'd come home. When she finally did, she was brimming with excitement, going on about the property they'd seen and how perfect it would be for their first flip. I listened, nodding and offering the occasional comment, but my focus was elsewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As Sarah spoke, her eyes alight with enthusiasm, I realized it wasn't just about the house-flipping project. It was about Ryan. He had become a spark in her life, a source of energy and excitement that I hadn't been for years. And for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake by agreeing to this project. The next few weeks unfolded with an unsettling routine. Ryan's presence in our lives became a constant, like a guest who overstayed his welcome but managed to charm everyone in the room. He and Sarah had taken the plunge and purchased the Victorian house she had been so enamored with. It needed extensive renovations, and Ryan assured us that his network of contractors could handle the job with ease. At first, I tried to stay involved, tagging along to site visits when my schedule allowed. The house was as daunting as Sarah described. Peeling wallpaper, creaking floors, and a kitchen that looked straight out of a 1970s sitcom. But I could see the potential in it just as Sarah did. She was invigorated, buzzing with ideas about paint colors, fixtures, and furniture arrangements. Imagine how beautiful this place will be when it's finished, Sarah said one afternoon, standing in the gutted living room. Her eyes gleamed with excitement. This could be the start of something really big for us. I'm sure it will be, I replied, forcing a smile. But as I watched her turn to Ryan, her tone shifted. What do you think? She asked him, her voice lighter, more playful. Ryan grinned, gesturing around the room. It's a diamond in the rough. But with your vision, Sarah, it's going to shine. Their interaction left a bitter taste in my mouth. Maybe it was the way she leaned closer to him when they spoke or how he always seemed to find an excuse to touch her. A hand on her back as they walked through the house, a brief brush of fingers when he handed her a clipboard. None of it seemed inappropriate on the surface, but the cumulative effect was like a splinter lodged deep under my skin. One evening, Sarah came home later than usual. She was flushed and breathless, her hair slightly disheveled. Sorry I'm late, she said, setting her purse on the kitchen counter. Ryan and I had to meet with the contractors about the plumbing. It's a nightmare, but we're figuring it out. No problem, I said, though I felt the familiar knot tighten in my stomach. You hungry? I made pasta. Oh, I already ate, she said, waving a hand. We grabbed a quick bite while we were out. The knot pulled tighter. You and Ryan? She hesitated, her eyes flicking to mine. Yeah, we were working late and it made sense. I didn't think you'd mind. I don't, I said quickly, though the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. Just, maybe let me know next time. She nodded, but her attention had already shifted, pulling out her laptop to check emails. I stood there for a moment watching her, feeling like a ghost in my own home. The next weekend, Ryan invited us to a local real estate event he was hosting. It was a networking mixer at an upscale downtown venue, all sleek lines and dim lighting. Sarah insisted we attend, and I reluctantly agreed. I spent most of the evening nursing a drink, half listening to conversations about market trends and renovation tips. Sarah, meanwhile, was in her element. She floated through the room with Ryan at her side, laughing and chatting with ease. I felt like an outsider, tethered to the edges of her orbit but never quite in the center. At one point, I spotted Ryan guiding her to the dance floor. It wasn't an overtly romantic dance, but there was an intimacy in the way his hand rested on her waist, the way their movements synchronized. When they returned, Sarah's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. She leaned down to me, resting a hand on my arm. "Are you having fun?" she asked. "Sure," I replied, though my tone betrayed me. Her smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, turning back to Ryan as he made a joke about the event's hors d'oeuvres. That night, as we drove home, I finally gave voice to the thoughts that had been gnawing at me. "You and Ryan seem to spend a lot of time together," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. Sarah glanced at me, her brow furrowing. "David, we're working on the house. Of course we spend time together." "I know," I said, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "It's just, I don't know. It feels like he's here more than he needs to be." "You're being ridiculous," she said, her tone sharp. "Ryan's been nothing but professional. He's helping us, David. Don't make this into something it's not." Her words stung, but I couldn't argue. Maybe I was being ridiculous. Maybe my own insecurities were clouding my judgment. But as we pulled into the driveway and Sarah went inside without another word, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. One casual touch at a time. The transition from casual interactions to something more deliberate was so gradual that, at first, I couldn't pinpoint when it started. Ryan and Sarah's shared enthusiasm for the renovation project made their time together seem natural, even necessary. But then the boundaries began to blur. It was a Friday evening when Sarah mentioned she and Ryan were heading out to look at design ideas. She framed it as work, and I'd wanted to believe her. "It's for the house," she said, slipping into a fitted jacket as she stood by the door. "There's this art gallery downtown that has incredible prints and fixtures. Ryan thought it might spark some ideas." I was seated at the dining table, staring at my laptop, but my attention was fully on her. "Can't it wait until tomorrow? Or we could go together this weekend." "They're only displaying this collection tonight," she replied, brushing her hair back with a practiced hand. "And it's more about brainstorming for the design. You wouldn't enjoy it." The dismissal stung, but I bit back a response. I'd become adept at ignoring the small slights. The way she spoke of Ryan with more warmth than she used with me. The way her voice softened when she mentioned his name. I told myself it was my imagination. "Have fun," I muttered, not looking up. She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to say something more. But then she grabbed her bag and left, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing in the silence of the house. That night, I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept wandering. Around 9 p.m., I called her phone, only for it to go straight to voicemail. I told myself it was nothing. They were probably in a noisy gallery, and she'd call back soon. But by the time 11 rolled around with no word, I was pacing the living room, my stomach in knots. Finally, just before midnight, the headlights of her car swept across the driveway. I heard her key in the lock, and a moment later, she stepped inside, carrying a small shopping bag. "You're still up?" she asked, her tone casual as she set her bag down on the counter. "It's late," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You didn't answer your phone." She frowned, pulling her phone out of her pocket and glancing at the screen. "Oh, the battery died. Sorry about that. The gallery was amazing. You should have seen some of the pieces." "Did you buy anything?" I asked, eyeing the bag. "Just a print for the dining room. It was such a good deal, and Ryan agreed it would fit perfectly with the vibe we're going for." "Ryan again." I felt my jaw tighten. "Seems like you two have a lot of fun together." She froze for a fraction of a second before giving me a cautious look. "David, what's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said quickly, shaking my head. "Forget it. I'm just tired." She studied me for a moment longer, then sighed. "I'm doing this for us, you know? The house, the flipping project. It's all for our future. Ryan's just helping me make it happen." I nodded, forcing a smile. But as she headed upstairs, her words offered little comfort. Over the next week, their outings became more frequent. What started as sporadic visits to hardware stores and showrooms turned into long evenings and weekend trips. One Saturday, I decided to join them. I told Sarah I wanted to be more involved in the project. And while she seemed reluctant, she didn't outright refuse. The three of us spent the day at a sprawling home improvement warehouse, poring over tiles and fixtures. Ryan was his usual charismatic self, effortlessly commanding attention as he joked with Sarah and charmed the store clerks. I tried to insert myself into their conversations, but I often felt like a third wheel. By the afternoon, my patience had worn thin. As Sarah and Ryan debated the merits of two different backsplash designs, I stepped away, feigning interest in a display of lighting fixtures. When I glanced back, they were laughing at some private joke, their heads tilted toward each other. It was in that moment that the seed of doubt I'd been ignoring began to sprout into something darker. I told myself it was nothing, that their closeness was just a byproduct of working together. But deep down, I knew better. The following Friday, Sarah came home late again. This time, she didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. Instead, I stayed in my office, nursing a glass of whiskey and replaying every interaction between her and Ryan in my mind. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock at the door. Sarah stepped in, her expression hesitant. "David," she said, sitting on the edge of my desk. "I feel like you've been upset with me lately. If something's bothering you, just tell me." I stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for signs of guilt or remorse. But all I saw was a mixture of concern and exhaustion. "I'm fine," I said finally, my voice hollow. "Just work stuff." She reached out, her hand brushing mine. "I'm here if you want to talk about it." I nodded, but I didn't take her hand. After a moment, she sighed and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As the door clicked shut behind her, I realized I wasn't just losing her. I was losing myself, and I didn't know how to stop it. It happened on a rainy Wednesday evening. Sarah had told me earlier in the week that she and Ryan would be staying late at the Victorian house to finalize some details with the contractors. At first, I didn't think much of it. Late nights and long hours had become routine for them. But as the hours ticked by, unease settled over me like the storm clouds blanketing the sky. By the time the clock struck 9 p.m., I couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion any longer. I dialed Sarah's phone, and as it rang, I stared out the window at the rain streaking down the glass. The call went to voicemail. I tried again with the same result. My hand tightened around the phone as I paced the living room, every worst-case scenario playing out in my mind. When the clock hit 10:30, I grabbed my keys and headed out. The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield as I drove toward the house. My rational mind told me I was being paranoid, but something deeper pushed me forward, an instinct I couldn't ignore. I parked a block away, not wanting to draw attention to myself. The house loomed in the darkness, its outline barely visible against the storm. Light spilled out from one of the upstairs windows, and I could make out faint shadows moving behind the curtains. My chest tightened as I approached, the sound of rain muffling my footsteps. The front door was locked, but the side entrance was slightly ajar. I slipped inside, my heart pounding in my ears. The house was eerily silent except for the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I followed the faint sound of voices upstairs, my breath shallow as I climbed the staircase. As I reached the second floor, I stopped outside a half-closed door. Through the gap, I could see them. Sarah was standing near a large drop cloth, her back to me. Ryan was close, too close. His hand rested lightly on her waist as they examined a sheet of blueprints spread out on a makeshift table. "This layout, it's perfect," Sarah said, her voice soft but vibrant. "You always know how to bring my ideas to life." "That's because your ideas are brilliant," Ryan replied, his tone dripping with admiration. He leaned in, his hand sliding a fraction lower, resting on the curve of her hip. "You make everything better." I felt my stomach churn as Sarah turned to face him. There was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of doubt in her expression. But then Ryan stepped closer, cupping her face with one hand, and kissed her. Time seemed to freeze. The sound of rain faded into the background, replaced by the blood roaring in my ears. I wanted to burst through the door, to demand answers, to put an end to whatever this was. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my mind paralyzed by the reality of what I was witnessing. Sarah didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands sliding up his arms as their kiss deepened. The intimacy of it was unbearable, a stark contrast to the lukewarm affection she had shown me in recent months. I forced myself to step back, my hand gripping the banister for support. I couldn't watch anymore. My chest heaved with silent breaths as I turned and descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time I reached the door, I was drenched in rain and sweat, my vision blurred by a mix of water and tears. I drove aimlessly through the storm, my mind racing. Every kiss, every touch I just witnessed played on a loop in my head, each replay cutting deeper. I'd suspected something was wrong, but seeing it confirmed was a different kind of agony. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as anger and heartbreak warred within me, leaving me numb. When I finally pulled into our driveway, it was well past midnight. The house was dark, silent, as if mocking the chaos within me. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the rain-soaked windshield, trying to decide what to do next. Confront her? Demand an explanation? Or let it fester, hoping it would somehow resolve itself? I chose none of those options. Instead, I walked inside, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and sat in the darkened living room. The storm outside raged on, but inside, a colder storm was brewing. One I wasn't sure I could weather. When Sarah finally came home, it was nearly 2 a.m. I heard her footsteps in the foyer, the soft rustle of her coat as she hung it up. She paused when she saw me sitting in the dim light, her face unreadable. "You're still up?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Couldn't sleep?" I replied, swirling the whiskey in my glass. I didn't look at her, keeping my gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. "How was the meeting?" "Productive," she said after a pause. "We got a lot done." I nodded, the bitterness in my chest threatening to spill over. "Glad to hear it." She lingered for a moment longer, then quietly made her way upstairs. I listened to her footsteps fade, then leaned back in my chair, staring into the darkness. The image of her and Ryan was seared into my mind, a wound that wouldn't close. I'd seen the truth with my own eyes, but the question remained. What was I going to do about it? Life didn't shatter after that night. Instead, it bent under the weight of an unspoken truth. Sarah and I carried on as though nothing had changed, but everything had. The gap between us, which had been growing unnoticed for months, now yawned like a canyon. She didn't seem to notice my strained smiles or my sudden aversion to the touch we once shared. Or if she did, she didn't mention it. Her work with Ryan continued unabated. Their meetings became even more frequent as the renovations picked up speed. She'd leave early in the mornings, dressed sharply, her phone already buzzing with messages from him. In the evenings, she'd return home, flushed and tired, carrying the scent of sawdust and paint. I'd sit at the dining table, dinner waiting, and ask, "How was your day?" Her answers were always variations of the same. "Busy, but good. We're making so much progress." I thought bitterly, the word clawing at my insides. She never spoke of Ryan directly, but his presence loomed over every detail she shared. I imagined his laughter echoing in the gutted halls of the Victorian house, his hands brushing hers as they examined samples, his voice a low murmur as he leaned in too close. The images consumed me, a poison I couldn't purge. One evening, I decided to visit the house unannounced. Sarah had mentioned she'd be there late, finalizing the floor installation with Ryan and the contractors. I told her I had a meeting, and she'd barely looked up from her phone as she said goodbye. The drive felt endless. The rain from earlier in the week had cleared, leaving the streets damp and shimmering under the streetlights. When I pulled up to the house, it stood dark and imposing, the windows glowing faintly from the inside. I parked a block away and approached on foot, my footsteps silent on the wet pavement. I entered through the side door, which was ajar as usual. The faint hum of voices reached me from upstairs. I climbed the staircase slowly, each step measured, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the second floor, I paused outside the room where the voices were loudest. "It's all coming together," Sarah was saying. Her voice held that bright, animated tone she used when she was truly excited. I can't believe how perfect it looks. You've got an incredible vision, Ryan replied. I've never worked with anyone who has such an eye for detail. Stop, she said, laughing. But there was no admonishment in her tone, only warmth. I couldn't bring myself to step inside, couldn't bear to see the way she smiled at him. Instead, I backed away, my chest tight, and left the house as quietly as I'd come. The fresh air hit me like a blow as I stepped outside, but it did nothing to clear my head. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The days blurred into weeks. Sarah's routine revolved around the house, and I fell into a routine of my own. Avoidance. I buried myself in work, leaving early and coming home late. On weekends, I'd find excuses to be out of the house, pretending not to notice how quickly Sarah agreed to my absences. One Saturday, I stayed home, determined to confront her. But when the morning came, she was already gone, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. Meeting Ryan at the house. Don't wait up. I crumpled the note in my fist, the words burning into my mind. She didn't even bother hiding it anymore. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to say the words I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. Instead, I went about my day as if nothing were wrong, the weight of my silence growing heavier with each passing hour. One evening, I decided to confide in someone. My friend Mark had known Sarah and me since college, and though we drifted apart in recent years, I trusted him to listen without judgment. We met at a quiet bar downtown, the kind of place where no one asked questions. You look like hell, Mark said as I slid into the booth. What's going on? I hesitated, staring at the amber liquid in my glass. It's Sarah, I said finally. I think something's going on with her and this guy she's working with. Mark frowned, his brow furrowing. What makes you think that? I told him everything. The late nights, the constant meetings, the way she lit up around Ryan in a way she hadn't with me in years. When I finished, Mark let out a low whistle. Have you confronted her? He asked. No, I admitted. What if I'm wrong? What if it's all in my head? Mark shook his head. David, you're not doing yourself any favors by staying silent. If you think something's going on, you need to talk to her. Otherwise, it'll eat you alive. His words stayed with me as I drove home that night. He was right. The silence was killing me. And yet, I couldn't shake the fear of what I might uncover if I pressed too hard. For now, it was easier to pretend, to let the pieces of my life teeter on the edge rather than risk breaking them entirely. But deep down, I knew the truth wouldn't stay buried forever. The quiet tension in our marriage shifted to something sharper, more dangerous. Sarah and Ryan's connection, once hidden in the guise of professionalism, now felt brazen. Late nights at the Victorian house turned into weekend trips to source materials. The excuses she offered became flimsier, almost as if she stopped caring whether I believed them or not. And I let it happen. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. Sarah had gone out early, leaving me alone in the house with a cryptic, "Don't wait up." Her car's absence gnawed at me as the hours stretched on. I paced the living room, debating whether to confront her or to follow her. Finally, the latter won out. I drove aimlessly at first, unsure of where she might have gone. But as I passed by the Victorian house, instinct told me to stop. Her car wasn't there, but Ryan's sleek Audi was parked out front. My pulse quickened, anger bubbling just below the surface. If not here, then where? A gnawing suspicion pulled me downtown. Ryan often mentioned his favorite spots during casual conversations I'd overheard between him and Sarah. I checked a few cafes and restaurants before spotting them through the window of a trendy rooftop bar. There they were, seated at a corner table. Sarah leaned in close to Ryan, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. He said something that made her laugh, a genuine, full-bodied laugh that I hadn't heard in years. My fists clenched involuntarily. I parked nearby and climbed the stairs to the rooftop, my heart pounding harder with each step. The air was heavy with the scent of overpriced cocktails and rooftop heaters, and the chatter of patrons buzzed in my ears. but my focus was laser-sharp on them. I stopped a few feet from their table, the sight of them together freezing me in place. Sarah's face glowed with an ease I hadn't seen in a long time. Her eyes locked on Ryan's, as if he were the only person in the world. They hadn't noticed me yet, too wrapped up in their bubble of intimacy. Something in me snapped. "Sarah," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Her head whipped around, her eyes wide with surprise. And something else. Guilt? Fear? Ryan's expression shifted, a calculated calm spreading over his face as he leaned back in his chair. "David," Sarah stammered, standing abruptly. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back, my eyes flicking to Ryan. "This doesn't look like sourcing materials." Ryan rose to his feet, his demeanor infuriatingly composed. "David, let's not make a scene." "A scene?" I took a step closer, my voice rising despite myself. "You think this is about a scene? You've been sneaking around with my wife, and you want me to play nice?" "David, stop," Sarah said, her voice low and pleading. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Then why don't you enlighten me? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for months." The surrounding patrons were starting to notice, their conversations dying down as they turned to watch the unfolding drama. Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but I didn't care. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. Ryan raised his hands in a placating gesture. "David, I think we should talk about this privately. This isn't the place." "No," I said firmly, my gaze never leaving Sarah. "We're doing this now." She looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but instead, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with Ryan. My chest heaved with anger and frustration as I watched her retreating figure. Ryan's calm voice broke through my haze. "You don't want to do this here, David. Let her cool off and we can talk later." I turned to him, my vision tunneling. "Stay away from her," I growled. "Whatever this is, it ends now." Ryan didn't reply. Instead, he gave me a small nod, his expression unreadable, and walked back toward the bar. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing with questions and accusations, before finally heading back to my car. When I got home, the house was dark. Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway, and I had no idea where she'd gone. I poured myself a drink and sat in the living room, the events of the evening replaying over and over in my head. Hours passed before I heard her key in the lock. She stepped inside, her expression guarded. Without a word, she walked past me and headed upstairs. I didn't follow. Instead, I sat there, staring at the empty glass in my hand, the weight of everything threatening to crush me. The storm I'd been trying to contain was no longer brewing. It was here, and there was no turning back now. The next morning, I woke to an empty bed. Sarah had either left early or never come to bed at all. The quiet house felt oppressive, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creaks of the floorboards. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee I'd poured, but couldn't bring myself to drink. My thoughts churned endlessly, replaying every word, every glance, every moment from the night before. Sarah's retreat from the rooftop bar, her refusal to speak, Ryan's calm demeanor. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. And yet, part of me clung to the hope that I was wrong, that there was still some explanation that didn't involve betrayal. Around noon, the front door creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale. She carried the weight of someone who had been awake all night, her eyes rimmed with red as if she'd been crying. She didn't meet my gaze as she set her bag on the counter and leaned against it, as if bracing herself. "We need to talk," she said softly. The words felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit, but she stayed where she was, her hands gripping the counter tightly. "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice trembling. "But you deserve the truth." My heart pounded as I waited, every second stretching into an eternity. Finally, she looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time that day. Ryan and I, we've been... She trailed off, the words catching in her throat. She didn't need to finish. I already knew. How long? I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. A few months, she admitted, her eyes filling with tears. It started as just harmless flirting. But then it turned into something more. I clenched my fists, fighting to keep my emotions in check. Something more, I echoed bitterly. So all those late nights, all those excuses, they were just lies? It wasn't like that, she said quickly, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't mean for it to happen? I interrupted, my anger bubbling to the surface. You mean you just tripped and fell into his arms? Into his bed. Her face crumpled, and she covered it with her hands. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry, David. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I couldn't bear to be in the same room with her. I walked to the window, staring out at the street, my mind racing. Every memory we'd built, every promise we'd made, it all felt like a lie. Why? I asked after a long silence, my voice raw. Why him? She hesitated, her hands falling to her sides. I don't know, she said finally. He made me feel seen, wanted. I felt so distant from you, David, like we've been living separate lives. And he was just there. Her words struck a nerve, and I turned to face her. So it's my fault? I demanded. You're saying I drove you to this? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. I'm not blaming you. This is on me. I should have talked to you, I should have... Her voice faltered, and she looked down, unable to continue. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my anger. And what now? I asked. Are you in love with him? She flinched at the question, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know what I feel anymore. Her uncertainty was the final blow. I turned away, unable to look at her. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my coat and heading for the door. The cold air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside. I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, the sound of my footsteps on the pavement the only thing grounding me. My mind churned with questions and accusations, but no answers came. How had we gotten here? Had I been blind to the cracks in our marriage? Or had she simply chosen to look elsewhere instead of fixing them? And most importantly, was there any way back from this? When I finally returned home, the house was quiet. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, and for a brief moment, I wondered if she'd left for good. But then I saw her coat hanging by the door and her shoes neatly placed by the stairs. She was still here somewhere. I sank onto the couch, staring at the darkened TV screen. The weight of her confession pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. I had demanded the truth, and now that I had it, I wasn't sure what to do with it. The one thing I did know was that nothing would ever be the same. The days following Sarah's confession were a blur. We moved through the house like strangers, our words clipped and cautious, as if the wrong phrase might shatter the fragile ceasefire between us. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. My mind played cruel tricks, conjuring images of her and Ryan, their stolen moments of intimacy, each one a knife twisting in my chest. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, closure, something to help me make sense of the chaos that had become my life. We need to talk, I said one evening, finding Sarah in the kitchen. She was standing by the sink, her hands motionless in the soapy water as she stared out the window. She turned to face me, her eyes weary. Okay, she said softly, drying her hands on a towel and sitting at the table. I joined her, the silence between us stretching painfully. Finally, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since her confession. Why didn't you just tell me? When things started to change between us, why didn't you say something? She sighed, looking down at her hands. I don't know, she admitted. I guess I was scared. Scared that you'd brush me off, or that things wouldn't change. And then, Ryan was there. He made me feel alive, in a way I hadn't felt in years. Her words stung, but I forced myself to stay calm. And now? What do you feel now? She hesitated, her lips trembling. I don't know, she said finally. I'm so sorry, David. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I said quietly. And I can't just pretend like everything's okay. I don't even know if I can forgive you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I understand, she said, her voice breaking. I don't deserve your forgiveness. The conversation ended there, both of us retreating to separate corners of the house. The weight of unspoken words lingered between us, heavy and suffocating. The next day, I took a half day at work and drove to the Victorian house. I needed to confront Ryan, to look him in the eye and demand answers. When I arrived, the place was empty, the renovations stalled for the day. I parked and waited, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't long before his sleek Audi pulled up. Ryan stepped out, his confident swagger only fueling my rage. When he saw me, his expression faltered, but he quickly composed himself. David, he said, his tone cautious. I wasn't expecting you. We need to talk, I said, my voice cold. He nodded, gesturing toward the house. Let's go inside. I followed him into the empty living room. The bare walls and unfinished floors a stark contrast to the fury roiling inside me. How long has this been going on? I demanded, cutting straight to the point. Ryan sighed, leaning against the wall. A few months, he admitted. It wasn't supposed to happen. It just did. You just happened to start an affair with my wife? I snapped, my fists clenched at my sides. Do you have any idea what you've done? He held up his hands defensively. David, I'm not going to make excuses. I crossed a line and I'm sorry. But Sarah, she's amazing. She deserves to feel loved. And, don't you dare, I interrupted, stepping closer. Don't you dare try to justify this. You don't get to decide what she deserves. Ryan fell silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said finally. I'll step away. I'll end it. It's already over, I said firmly. Stay away from her. From both of us. He nodded, his shoulders slumping as he realized there was nothing left to say. I turned and walked out, the weight of the confrontation lifting only slightly as I got into my car and drove away. That evening, Sarah and I had another conversation. This time it was final. We can't keep doing this, I said, sitting across from her at the dining table. This a marriage. It's broken, Sarah. And I don't think we can fix it. She nodded, her tears falling silently. I know, she whispered. I hate what I've done to us. But if this is what you need, I won't fight you. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the clearest. The life we'd built together had crumbled, and there was no salvaging it. By the end of the week, Sarah had packed a bag and moved out, leaving the house eerily quiet. As I stood in the empty bedroom, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the air, I realized that the end of our marriage wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something new, though what that would be, I couldn't yet say. The process of disentangling a life shared for over a decade was as excruciating as it was inevitable. Sarah and I agreed early on to keep things amicable, but the wounds from her betrayal were too fresh for genuine civility. Our conversations were clipped, polite only on the surface. Beneath it all, resentment simmered like a low flame, threatening to erupt at the slightest provocation. We decided to handle the divorce without dragging it through the courts. Our lawyer acted as a mediator, drafting agreements for property division, debts, and the sale of the house. The house, it was both a sanctuary and a battlefield, filled with memories that felt tainted now. The Victorian renovation project was left in limbo. Sarah suggested we sell it as is, splitting whatever profit we could manage. I agreed, eager to rid myself of the constant reminder of what we had lost. The weeks that followed were grueling. Friends and family tiptoed around the subject, their pitying glances only adding to the weight on my shoulders. Mark, ever the blunt realist, didn't hold back. You're better off without her, he said over beers one Friday night. She made her choice. Now it's your turn to move on. I wanted to agree, but the truth was more complicated. Moving on sounded simple in theory, but the scars she left weren't easily healed. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. The final mediation meeting took place on a rainy afternoon in a sterile office downtown. Sarah sat across from me, her expression unreadable. She wore the same perfume she'd worn on our wedding day, and the scent sent an unexpected pang through my chest. I forced myself to focus on the legalese spilling from the lawyer's mouth. When it was time to sign the papers, my hand trembled slightly as I scrawled my name across the dotted line. Sarah hesitated before signing, her eyes meeting mine for a brief, charged moment. In that instant, I saw the guilt, the regret, the sorrow she carried. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. She signed, and with that, our marriage was officially over. The weight of finality settled over me as we walked out of the building. Sarah stopped me at the curb, her voice soft and hesitant. "David, I'm sorry," she said, "for everything. I hope you find happiness again." I stared at her, the rain dampening her hair and streaking her face like tears. "Take care, Sarah," I said simply before walking away. The next few months were a study in rebuilding. I moved into a smaller apartment on the other side of town, a modest place with none of the echoes of my old life. The emptiness was both comforting and suffocating, but it was mine. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and longer hours. It wasn't a solution, but it kept my mind occupied. Slowly, I began to reconnect with parts of myself I'd forgotten. Old hobbies, long-neglected friendships, simple joys I'd overlooked in the haze of a failing marriage. One afternoon, while organizing boxes from the move, I came across our wedding album. I opened it hesitantly, the images staring back at me like ghosts from another life. There we were, young and full of hope, laughing and dancing under a canopy of twinkling lights. I traced a finger over Sarah's face, my chest tightening. I closed the album and set it aside. Not in anger, but in acceptance. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was mine to shape. Months turned into a year. The Victorian house eventually sold to a young couple eager to restore its charm. When the check arrived, I deposited it without a second thought, using part of the funds to take a long overdue trip. I hiked through national parks, stood in awe of towering mountains, and let the fresh air fill my lungs. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Sarah and I didn't keep in touch, though I heard through mutual friends that she'd moved to another city. Whether she was with Ryan or not, I didn't care. Her chapter in my life was closed. On the anniversary of our divorce, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the skyline. A glass of wine in hand, I thought about the man I'd been when Sarah and I first met. Optimistic, carefree, trusting. And I thought about the man I was now, scarred but stronger, cautious but wiser. The pain of betrayal had carved deep grooves into my soul, but it hadn't destroyed me. If anything, it had taught me the value of resilience, of self-worth, of choosing myself. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I raised my glass to the future, ready to embrace whatever it held. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.